We're continuing our study of the Seminar of Jacques Lacan, Book 1, Freud's Papers on Technique, 1953 to 1954. This time we're looking at Chapter 8, titled The Wolf, the Wolf. Much of this chapter is a psychoanalyst's presentation on her treatment of a child and the child's psychosis. This is less interesting than some of the comments Lacan makes before and after the presentation, because those are comments that relate to the fundamentals of the psychoanalytic framework. Lacan gives us an illuminating quotation from Freud's On Narcissism about the structural conditions of neurosis. Here is a large chunk of that quote on page 90. Lacan says, quote, "A patient suffering from hysteria or obsessional neurosis has, as far as his illness extends, given up his relation to reality. But analysis shows that he has by no means broken off his erotic relations to people and things. He still retains them in fantasy. That is to say, he has, on the one hand, substituted for real objects imaginary ones from his memory, or has mixed the latter with the former. On the other hand, he has renounced the initiation of motor activities for the attainment of his aims in connection with those objects." End quote. This quote represents a full-throated endorsement of how Freud shined light on the relationship between the imaginary and the real in neurotics. Remember, for Lacan, the imaginary is the world as it appears to us and our senses, and the real is that which can't be captured by any symbolization. It's what the tree looks like when no one is looking at it. It is the unconscious. It is all those things that we can't consciously access. Neurotics content themselves with fantasy. They are different, of course, than psychotics, who require different treatment. A child who suffers from psychosis is much more malleable than his or her fully developed counterpart. According to Lacan, on page 104, let's skip there. Lacan says, quote, "The entire problem of psychosis is that there is a synthesis of the imaginary and the real." End quote. The imaginary and the real registers are one and the same for someone suffering from psychosis. Neurotics, on the other hand, don't mix the imaginary and the real registers. Instead, they suffer from a highly developed, quite destructive superego. They are beholden to it, to the superego, as some abstract law, as if it's some authority figure that they imagine is dictating the terms to them. Moving back to page 102, Lacan says, quote, "The superego is an imperative for someone suffering from neurosis. You must do this or you mustn't do that," is what the person suffering neurosis thinks. But this is senseless, Lacan says. He goes on to say on page 102, "The superego is at one and the same time the law and its destruction. As such, it is speech itself, the commandment of law, insofar as nothing more than its roots remains. The law is entirely reduced to something which cannot even be expressed, like the 'you must,' which is speech deprived of all its meaning. It is in this sense that the superego ends up by being identified with only what is most devastating, most fascinating in the primitive experiences of the subject." This is admittedly an obscure passage and requires more of an explication, but let's go ahead and stop there, and we'll try to get to it in the next lesson. Thank you for listening.